Welcome to War and Magic. I'm Mary Dombrowski, and I'm here at Pleasant Beach on Bainbridge Island, at the site where Jack Klamm's parents had their summer cabin. Jack spent happy boyhood summers here, playing with the local Japanese kids, and it was here where he later lived with his wife and baby daughter. In this episode, we drop into the conversation between Jack Klamm and retired Naval Commander Robert Dashiell at the point where they're talking about Jack's involvement with the relocation of the Japanese. Jack was particularly close to Taiki Nishimura and his family, and their conversation then moves on to events in World War II at Fort Ward, which is just a short stroll down this beach.
Mr. Nishimura had been arrested prior to the relocation for failing to turn in 6 sticks of dynamite, according to the presidential order that all enemy aliens turn in cameras, explosives, and so on. And there were 15 arrested on Bainbridge Island. And Mr. Nishimura knew there were 6 sticks of dynamite somewhere on the farm, which is just up the street here, by the ways. And he reported that it was before the deadline that somewhere were 6 sticks of dynamite, but he couldn't find them. But because he didn't find them until after the deadline, he was arrested. Our family attorney, which fortunately he was an ex-federal judge, knew what buttons to push, and Mr. Nishimura was released as having been improperly imprisoned. Okay. So that was a nice little involvement there that I had with the family, but I was pretty close to the Japanese community here.
How did you get close to the Japanese community? Was it just...
My folks bought summer property here in 1922, and on Pleasant Beach, which is within walking distance of Fort Ward. And we in the summertime, we kids grew up together, including Taiki Nishimura, who was exactly my age. And we were buddies. We had a lot of fun together, and eventually Taiki got his ham license because of involvement with me, because I'd had a ham license since I was age 15 in a sophomore in high school. And I would set up crude equipment in the summertime here, because in those days, most of us couldn't afford the fancy stuff for voice transmission. It was all Morse code, or almost all. But Taiki and I were buddies, and I had met him originally through just neighbor kids playing on the beach together, and it was so that's how I got acquainted with the family, and so well acquainted with them that when my daughter was born, by the way, I was in radio school at Fort Ward when my daughter was born on the 16th of April of 42. 41, I mean, 1941, and Mrs. Nishimura, Taiki's mother, gave the baby a baby blanket. The families were that close.
Jack, could you tell me, where was your family living during this period?
Well, when Pearl Harbor hit, my family was in a very, what I call, precarious position. I had to moved them to Seattle to get better facilities for the little baby. I mean, I didn't want to keep them in a house at Pleasant Beach, which I was renting by then, because our summer cabin was single board and cold water only. But this house, the Wright house across, Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, owner's name, across the street was a little less primitive, but we had 2 stoves instead of 1. I rented an apartment, an attic apartment. Of course, housing was terribly short with the shipyards going full blast, Boeing going full blast, and they wouldn't show me this apartment until nighttime. And I found out why when I moved in a couple of days later. A beautiful view of the garbage dump. It was on the west side of Queen Anne Hill. There's now a putting green and a driving range there now, but I was just on 14th and 15th is your main arterial out there, and the other side is the garbage dump. I was frightened for my family because I knew that Puget Sound was vulnerable, and that it would be possible for Japanese to come in, and as they later demonstrated, and because and of course they, as you know, they their submarines did shell several coastal installations as time went on, and they even brought in one sub with that carried a special hangar that carried a float plane, and tried to set the force on fire with that unsuccessfully. But anyway, I got busy, and I was afraid for my family, so I bought 4¼ acres with a little 2/3 built house on it, or half built house. It was 2/3 by the time I sold it, out 5 miles north of Woodinville, way out in the boondocks.
In those days.
Pardon?
In those days.
In those days, yeah. I understand it's a development now, but well, Bear Creek ran right through my yard. Catch spawning salmon, right in my own yard, or trout. So anyway, that's I moved them out there with a big sigh of relief. It was rough on my wife, who hated country living, because she'd been raised on an apple ranch in outside of Wenatchee, about 24 miles north of Wenatchee, and loved the town life. But the safety of my family was more important. So I moved them out there, and I'm glad I did, because it would have been very easy for downtown to have been shelled, and the little apartment was right within easy range.
Do you think there was a general feel in Seattle that Seattle was a vulnerable city for a Japanese attack? I know they had blackout drills.
Well, my father was employed at Boeing at that time, and those people were very conscious of the possibility, and Boeing was camouflaged quite well, and so against a possible air identification. And my dad saw pictures taken by plane to double check the camouflage, and it was good. Yeah. It was a farm with an orchard.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's so anyway, yeah, I think more people were conscious in Seattle than they were in a lot of places. Unlike the Florida coast, which they didn't even want to turn off the lights for fear of hurting tourism, so a whole bunch of ships were sunk before they got around to doing that. But we lost ships off the west coast, which that kind of loss has virtually ceased after we relocated the Japanese, by the way. It was kind of interesting because our military, by decoding messages, was aware that ship sailings information was being transmitted to Tokyo.
Right.
So we lost, I think, 60-some ships off the west coast during the course of the early part of the war. But I've seen some figures published somewhere on that. But so anyway, I got my family out, and mighty glad that I did.
Well, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the feeling was. You came over and serviced the equipment at Fort Ward.
Oh, yeah.
Did you know what was going on at Fort Ward? This is one of the more
yes,
stories in American
I
history.
definitely knew they were intercepting Japanese messages, but I didn't know anything about how successful they were in decoding. I did know that the decoding was being done in Washington, not in Seattle, because I was not in Fort Ward, because I was part of the communication link. It was very, very important for me to maintain that link. In fact, we set a record, because we had some of the highest speed teletype in the world going from staff headquarters in Seattle to Washington. And I don't know how much technicality you know about speed of teletype operation.
Very little. Yeah.
Well, 60 words per minute was standard. We had a 90 word per minute teletype system, which was very touchy in its adjustments. But we set a record for all intercept stations and all communication links in 12 minutes after a message was intercepted at Fort Ward. The decoded, translated message was on the desk of the Navy head of intelligence.
That's amazing.
Of course, we prepared for this to set a record. Everything was fine-tuned. Everybody was ready to go. What you do when you set records. That's how Guinness records are set.
Yes. Yeah, the History Channel said that the intercepts perhaps saved anywhere from 1/2 to 1.5 years of World War II, and maybe up to 100,000 to 200,000 lives.
At least, yes. I think that's a conservative estimate.
Yes.
Because look at things like Wake Island, and I mean Midway Island. Midway, where because we knew that that was a Japanese prime target, with what limited military capability we had, we were prepared for it. And we broke the back of Japanese naval air power at Midway. They had expected another Pearl Harbor, as they refer to it, there. And but we were prepared as best we could. And we had brought 2 carriers back from the South Pacific, and secretly hurried them back. The Hornet and the Enterprise, and the Yorktown, which had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese thought they'd sunk it, but it had just limped into Pearl Harbor and wanted 90 days for repairs. They were given 3, but they could carry planes, ammunition, and so on, and so they were a good supplement. And so the 3 carriers made up the task force who set out to intercept the Japanese fleet. And the Japanese had thought that we were days away instead of hours away by the time they arrived at Midway. And by catching them off guard, because we got there just after the first bombing attempt while they were refueling and the planes, and caught them, as the saying goes, with their pants down. They had no protection, and we were able to sink all 4 main carriers of their task force. They had 3 light carriers that were back with Yamamoto's fleet, because he had hoped to suck in whatever fleet remains we had at Pearl Harbor and then jump them with the main Japanese fleet.
Right.
And but by knocking out all 4 carriers before they had been able to eliminate the resistance at Midway, meant that they had to call off the invasion plans, and that shifted the balance of air carrier power in the Pacific for all the rest of the war. It gave us a head start. Nimitz was adamant that the main strike was going to be at Midway, and unlike his contemporaries in Washington, they thought it might be anywhere, even possible Maine West Coast. But he satisfied himself with the tricky message, which you may or may not have heard about, of getting the Japanese to identify target Y, I think it was called. But of course, for security purposes, just like we did, they didn't say we're attacking Midway. They were saying we're attacking target Y. Well, where's target Y? And this was the question from Nimitz. Where was target Y? So he had a hunch, and they had already identified the Aleutians as a possible target through decoding coded messages. So he had Midway send an out in the open routine administrative message saying that their that their evaporation system for fresh water had broken down. And several days later, one of our intercept stations operated jointly with the Australians intercepted a routine military news, Japanese news message, military message, which included the statement that Target Y reported freshwater problems. That pinned it down.
Hadn't heard that story.
Well, Nimitz is quoted as saying that it took exquisite timing and a massive dose of luck to pull off this business of breaking the back of the Japanese invasion of attempt at Midway, or both. And fortunately, we had both.
Do you recall whether there were other intercept stations in the Puget Sound area, or was Fort Ward the only station?
To the best of my knowledge, Fort Ward was the only station in Puget Sound. The next nearest one that I am aware of was in Astoria, Oregon. And of course, there were many scattered around the whole Western Hemisphere. There was, and just like I mentioned some time ago, we were jointly operated one in Australia with the Australians, and I know that there were intercept stations in Dutch Harbor, and of course in Hawaii, and in fact there had been in the Philippines until the Philippines were invaded, and there was and in Guam, there was some degree of intercept going on in Guam before it was invaded. And therein lies another tale, which it happens to involve a ham radio operator. I haven't mentioned this before, but you may have been aware of somebody called the Ghost of Guam. And when the Japanese invaded Guam, a chief, a Navy chief there, radioman, managed to evade capture and slid back into the jungle and associated himself with natives who protected him, and he eventually cobbled together enough equipment to make contact, radio contact with the Navy, and this is very difficult to prove, identifying yourself. As you can imagine, the Navy or anybody like that would be very leery if somebody says, I'm a refugee from the Japs hiding out in Guam.
Absolutely.
But he succeeded in various ways by referring to personal information available only in his own bedroom at home in the States where his folks still lived and things like that. And eventually he established a good solid contact and was known as the Ghost of Guam. And he was a ham radio operator, and I talked to him before the war, just one ham to another, just by sheer coincidence. But that's just a little side story about but the important thing to the Navy was assurance that he had been able to destroy the code machines before, the code equipment, before the Japanese could capture them. And so that's why I brought that up, because it did concern an intercept station there.
Jack, could you describe some of the physical sites that you maybe saw around Puget Sound or Bainbridge Island during the beginning of World War II?
Oh yes, it was, you just never ever have seen before or since the coming together of the people to do, without being asked, to do everything. By the second day, there was, after Pearl, there was an anti-aircraft battery at the end of one of the piers at the Navy Yard. Shortly thereafter, barrage balloons started to show up. Now, for people who are not familiar with a barrage balloon, is what are they and why are they? Well, it's a balloon on the end of a long cable, and the purpose is to support the cable such that the dive bombers can't come swooping in and bomb because they're liable to tangle with the cable. Where the name barrage balloon came from, I don't know, but it's English in origin because they were first used in England. But everybody just turned to here. We understood what blackouts were for and what they were, and a lot of us were really not surprised by Pearl Harbor, but only the exact time and location. We knew something was going to happen, and so much so that I was not ahead of everybody. I was, I think, typical of quite a few people. On Pearl Harbor Day, when I was able to get to a telephone, long lines at the payphone at the Navy Yard, because it was a weekend which I did not have liberty, so I was on duty there. I told my wife where, in what drawer in the bureau to get the material out to black out the windows. I'd already prepared for it, and I was one of many. So so here we were very war conscious, being on the Pacific coast, a maritime city where we were in touch with the comings and goings, and the whole nature of things changed overnight. The people making their way in a totally blacked out town, me making my way from my blacked out apartment all the way down on Queen Anne Hill by the garbage dump, all the way down to the ferry terminal in total blackout, walking, and cars driving in total blackout.
No lights.
No lights. And later on, we were permitted to put blue cellophane over our parking lights and use that, because they were very hard to see from any distance. Hard for the driver to see also. But at least you now had grounds to sue somebody if they bumped into you. Nobody did, as far as I know, but everything moved at a slow, steady pace. And different interesting aspects. One of the things that many things we were concerned about, we, I mean people in general, was the possibility of sonic mines in the water. The possibility that submarine would have gotten in and dumped mines which would be set off by the beat of a propeller. And so for a while on the ferry going to Bremerton, and I presume on Bainbridge too, but I was stationed at Bremerton there for a little while after Pearl Harbor until I moved to staff headquarters, there would be a fellow up in the bow of the ship with an old 30-06 bolt action rifle firing into the water about once every 15-20 seconds. The theory being that the impact of the bullet on the water would create enough sound to set off a sonic mine ahead of the ferry if there was one. All these little different things. It was amazing. And our whole life suddenly changed. But another aspect of what happened the first few days, I mentioned an anti-aircraft battery set up at the end of one of the piers in the Navy Yard. There was another fellow like myself who didn't have a specific assignment. We were going to be going to this school which never materialized, which I had just been detached from the radio station to attend. So we looked for things to do to help, you know. We all did. And we got out there to this anti-aircraft battery, and here was another ham radio operator with some cobbled together equipment, because the Army was so shortchanged and so delinquent in technical equipment. Their communication setup was what we call mule pack radio left over from shortly after World War I. It didn't work. But they were a National Guard unit that had been activated. Mm-hmm. Well, this fellow who was their radio operator, their communications man, brought his ham radio station and altered it to operate on the proper military frequencies. But he had that equipment, but he didn't have an antenna. He didn't even have power to the equipment. So I knew what warehouse to raid, and so this other chap and myself kicked in the door of a particular warehouse on Sunday. No, it's Monday by then, Monday afternoon I guess it was, and I know we were not welcome, but we did anyway. We got the necessary wire for an antenna system, and we got extension cords to run power out to the fella, got him set up and got him on the air. So he had communications to contact the command that was in charge of the aircraft battery. But that was nothing, no special credit to us. People all over were doing things like that. Mm-hmm. But it sure made a difference. The whole world changed overnight.
Do you know if in the Puget Sound area, were there observers at night watching or in the daytime observing visually what was happening in Puget Sound?
Almost immediately. Mm-hmm. A volunteer setup. It was eventually organized. But I've even forgotten the names of the particular organization. But and there were beach walkers on the coast. But the whole thing started as a voluntary activity. And for example, that a little later when referring back to the submarine that we know got into the Sound, this is how one of the verifications of that submarine showed up. A beach walker found garbage from the submarine, including a vegetable crate with Japanese symbols on it. But only because it was a beach walker patrolling the beach voluntarily. Mm. And yes, everybody turned to. And we had not only beach walkers and people like that, we had observers for, that was better organized, for watching for airplanes. And this whole system got organized in a surprisingly rapid manner. And so many of those systems that I can't even remember them all. But everybody was there, and we had things covered. I mean, we really did.